The morning started like any other Tuesday in New York City. Thousands of people rushing through Grand Central Station, barely looking up from their phones, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging. Everyone moving with that particular urgency that comes from running just 5 minutes late. Nobody paid attention to the older man standing near the information booth, watching the crowd flow past him like a river. He looked completely ordinary. Actually, more than ordinary. His jacket had seen better days, with a small tear near the pocket that had been poorly stitched. The jeans were faded, not in that expensive designer way, but in the way that comes from actual wear. His sneakers were scuffed white canvas, the kind you find at discount stores. A baseball cap covered most of his silver hair, and he needed a shave. If you passed him on the street, you might drop $1 in his cup if he had one. But this man was worth $4 billion. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd spent the last 30 years building one of the most successful tech companies in America. His face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. He'd shaken hands with presidents. His signature was on patents that changed how the world communicated. Right now, his company's stock was trading at an all-time high, and his phone, which sat silent in his pocket, probably had 50 urgent messages waiting. He'd turned it off too. Hours ago, Robert had woken up that morning, in his penthouse apartment, overlooking Central Park. 20,000 square feet of marble and glass and art that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He'd stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows drinking coffee from a cup that cost $300, looking down at the city below. And he'd felt absolutely nothing. That numbness had been growing for months, maybe years if he was honest with himself. Every charity gala felt the same. Every board meeting blurred together. Every handshake from someone who wanted something from him felt hollow. He couldn't remember the last time someone had just talked to him like a regular person. Like Robert, not like Robert Chen, billionaire. So that morning he'd done something crazy. He'd walked into his massive closet, past the rows of custom suits that cost $5,000 each, past the Italian shoes and Swiss watches, and he dug into the back corner. There, in a box he hadn't opened in decades, he'd found his old clothes from college. They still fit more or less. A little tight around the middle maybe, but they worked. His driver had been confused when Robert told him to take the day off. His assistant had nearly panicked when he said he'd be unreachable. His head of security had actually argued with him, something about liability and insurance and what would happen if someone recognized him. Robert had smiled and promised to be careful. Then he'd walked out the service entrance of his building, the one the staff used, and he'd stepped onto the street as nobody. It was amazing how invisible you could be when you wanted to be. He'd taken the subway. Actually taken it. Not just posed for a photo opportunity like during his company's expansion announcement. He'd squeezed in between a student with headphones and a nurse in scrubs heading home from a night shift. Nobody looked at him twice. The student's elbow had bumped his ribs as the train lurched. The nurse had apologized when she'd stepped on his foot. These tiny, normal human interactions felt more real than anything he'd experienced in months. Now he stood in Grand Central, just watching. A kid, maybe 7 years old, had dropped his hot dog and was trying not to cry while his mother comforted him. An elderly couple held hands as they studied the departure board, probably planning a trip together. 2 friends hugged goodbye at the platform entrance, that kind of hug that meant they wouldn't see each other for a while. Life, real and messy and beautiful, was happening all around him. That's when he noticed the piano. It sat in the main concourse, black and glossy under the station's lights. A simple sign next to it read, "Play me, I'm yours." Robert had probably walked past it 100 times over the years, always in a hurry, always on his way to somewhere important. He'd never actually stopped to look at it. A few people had paused near it, running their fingers over the keys half-heartedly before walking away. Most people just rushed past without a glance. The piano sat there patient and waiting like it had all the time in the world. Robert felt his chest tighten. He hadn't thought about piano in so long. Hadn't let himself think about it, really. His mother had worked 2 jobs to afford his lessons when he was a kid. She'd wanted him to have something beautiful in his life. Something beyond their cramped apartment in Queens and the constant struggle to make rent. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she'd come home exhausted from her shift at the diner, change her clothes, and walk him 6 blocks to Mrs. Patterson's house for his lessons. He'd loved it. Not at first, when his fingers felt clumsy and the notes came out wrong, but gradually, as the music started to make sense, as his hands learned to find the right keys without looking, something magical had happened. For 1 hour, twice a week, he could disappear into sound. He could create something that didn't exist before. He could make his mother smile even when he knew she was tired down to her bones. Then she'd gotten sick. Cancer, aggressive and fast. The lessons had stopped. The hospital bills had piled up. She'd died 2 weeks after his 14th birthday, and Robert had never touched a piano again. He'd thrown himself into school instead, into computers and coding and building things that made logical sense, things that couldn't hurt you the way beauty could hurt you when you lost it. That was 45 years ago. Robert found his feet moving toward the piano before he'd made a conscious decision. His heart was beating faster. A security guard across the concourse noticed him approaching and straightened up, hand moving to his radio. Robert knew what he saw, a homeless-looking man heading toward the piano, probably to sleep on the bench or cause some kind of scene. Let him think that, Robert thought. Let everyone think that. He sat down on the bench. The wood was smooth and cool. Someone had carved initials into the side, a small act of permanent rebellion. The keys gleamed in front of him, black and white. 88 possibilities. His hands hovered over them, shaking slightly. What if he'd forgotten everything? What if 45 years had erased all those hours of practice, all those pieces he'd learned, all that muscle memory his mother had worked so hard to give him? What if he sat down at this piano in the middle of one of the busiest train stations in the world and nothing came out but noise? The security guard was definitely watching him now. A woman with a designer purse had steered wide around him, clutching her bag a little tighter. A businessman had glanced over with mild concern before checking his watch and hurrying on. Robert took a breath. He thought about his mother, about how she'd believed he had something special even when they had nothing else. He thought about the last 30 years of his life, building and acquiring and achieving, and how empty it had all started to feel. He thought about what it meant to be brave enough, to try something you'd lost even if you might fail in front of strangers. Then, he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes were terrible. Robert's fingers fumbled on the keys, producing a clumsy, disjointed sound that made him wince. It was exactly what he'd been afraid of. 45 years was a long time, and apparently long enough for his hands to forget everything they'd once known. A couple of teenagers nearby snickered as they walked past. The security guard's expression shifted from suspicious to dismissive. Just another guy wasting everyone's time. Robert felt heat rise in his cheeks. This had been a stupid idea. What was he thinking? Sitting down at a public piano after decades away from music. He should get up, walk away, pretend this embarrassing moment had never happened. That's what the old Robert would do. The Robert who'd built a tech empire knew when to cut his losses and move on. But something made him stay on that bench. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was the memory of his mother's voice, patient and encouraging, telling him that the hard part wasn't starting. It was keeping going when things got difficult. She'd said that about piano, but she'd really meant it about life. He closed his eyes and tried again. This time, he started with something simple. A melody his mother used to hum while cooking dinner. He didn't even know what it was called. Just a simple tune that had lived in his childhood home. His right hand picked out the notes slowly, carefully. They were still hesitant, but they were right. That was something. The station noise continued around him. Announcements echoed from the speakers about track changes and delays. Footsteps clicked and clacked on the marble floor. Someone's phone rang loudly nearby. But Robert kept playing, adding his left hand, now building a simple harmony underneath the melody. Gradually, like a rusty door slowly opening, things started to come back. His fingers began to remember their old pathways across the keys. The spaces between notes felt more natural. The rhythm evened out. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was becoming something more than noise. A man in a business suit slowed down as he passed, glancing over with mild curiosity before his phone buzzed and he hurried on. A janitor pushing a cleaning cart stopped for a moment, head tilted slightly, then continued with his work. Robert noticed none of this. His eyes were still closed, his focus entirely on the feeling of the keys under his fingertips. The melody his mother used to hum led naturally into something else. A piece he'd learned for his first recital. Mozart, something simple from the early sonatas. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had chosen it because it sounded more complicated than it actually was. Good for impressing parents, she'd said with a wink. His mother had been so proud that night, sitting in the front row of the community center in her best dress, the one she usually saved for church. The Mozart came back easier than he'd expected. Muscle memory was a strange thing. His conscious mind had forgotten this piece existed, but his hands remembered. They knew where to go, how to shape the phrases, when to get louder and when to pull back. It was like meeting an old friend after decades apart and discovering that the connection was still there, just waiting to be revived. Robert opened his eyes. His playing was steadier now, more confident. He wasn't fighting the piano anymore. He was having a conversation with it, and slowly the piano was starting to respond. The acoustics of Grand Central were incredible, he realized. The vaulted ceilings caught the sound and amplified it, sending it echoing through the vast space in a way that made even his rusty playing sound better than it was. He risked a glance around the station. Most people were still rushing past, absorbed in their own worlds. But a few had slowed down. An older woman with grocery bags had paused near a column, her head turned toward the piano. 2 college students with backpacks had stopped their conversation, both looking his way. The security guard who'd been watching him suspiciously was no longer reaching for his radio. He was just standing there listening. Something shifted in Robert's chest. He'd spent so many years performing for boards and investors, giving presentations, doing interviews. Every word calculated, every gesture strategic, everything designed to project confidence and control and vision. He'd become so good at being what other people needed him to be that he'd forgotten what it felt like to just be himself. But here, at this piano, in these worn clothes with no one knowing who he was or what he'd achieved, something felt different, real, true. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or convince them of anything. He was just playing because the music wanted to come out, and he'd kept it locked inside for too long. He finished the Mozart piece and transitioned without pause into something else. Chopin this time, a nocturne, one of the beautiful melancholy ones that his teacher had said was too advanced for him, but that he'd insisted on learning anyway. It had taken him 6 months to get it right, staying late after his regular lessons, practicing until his mother had to physically drag him away from Mrs. Patterson's piano so they could catch the last bus home. The Chopin was harder. His fingers weren't as nimble as they'd been at 14. There were passages that required speed and precision that he simply didn't have anymore. But there was something else he had now that he hadn't had as a teenager. Life experience, heartbreak, loss. The kind of deep, complicated emotions that Chopin had poured into these pieces. When you're young, you can play the notes perfectly, but miss the meaning. Now, even with imperfect technique, Robert understood what this music was about. It was about beauty that exists alongside sadness, about moments of grace that shine brighter because you know they won't last, about expressing feelings too big and complex for words. His hands moved across the keys with growing confidence. He made mistakes, hit wrong notes, stumbled over the technical passages, but none of that mattered because the emotion was there, honest and raw and real. The music swelled, filling the concourse with its bittersweet melody. More people were stopping now. A mother with a stroller had pulled over to the side, rocking gently as she listened. 3 teenagers who'd been laughing loudly over near the food court had gone quiet, drawn by the sound. A man in a delivery uniform had set down his packages and stood with his arms crossed, head nodding slightly to the rhythm. Robert didn't see any of this. He was lost in the music now, really lost in a way he hadn't been since he was a kid. The station disappeared. The people disappeared, even his own identity. All those layers of success and wealth and responsibility that had built up over decades seemed to fall away. There was just the piano, the music, and the feeling of coming home to something he didn't even know he'd been missing. The nocturne built toward its climax, the melody soaring over rippling arpeggios in the left hand. Robert's fingers flew, and for a few measures everything clicked perfectly. This was it. This was what it used to feel like when the music took over and you became just a channel for something bigger than yourself. Then his left hand cramped. The pain shot through his palm and up his wrist, sudden and sharp. His fingers spasmed, hitting 3 wrong keys at once in a jarring discord that shattered the musical spell. Robert gasped and pulled his hands back, cradling the cramping left hand against his chest. The music stopped abruptly. The silence felt enormous. Robert looked down at his hands. They were older now, marked with age spots and the faint scars from old injuries. These hands had signed billion-dollar deals, shaken hands with world leaders, typed millions of lines of code. But they'd forgotten how to do this one thing he'd loved most. Disappointment washed over him. So intense it was almost physical. For a few minutes there, he'd felt something real. Something that connected him to who he used to be before everything got so complicated. And now it was over. Ended by the simple limitations of an aging body. He started to stand up, ready to walk away from this failed experiment. But then he heard it. Someone was clapping. It was slow clapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind him. Robert turned on the bench, confused. The older woman with the grocery bags was applauding, a warm smile on her face. Then the college students joined in. Then the delivery guy. Then more people scattered throughout the concourse. People he hadn't even noticed had stopped to listen. They weren't clapping sarcastically or mockingly. They were clapping like they'd heard something that moved them, something worth acknowledging. The mother with the stroller was smiling. Even the security guard had a different expression now, something almost like respect. Robert sat frozen, overwhelmed. He'd played imperfectly, made mistakes, literally had to stop because his hand gave out, and they were applauding anyway. Not because he was Robert Chen, tech billionaire. They didn't know that. They were clapping for the music itself, for the attempt, for whatever it was they'd heard in those imperfect notes. The clapping faded, and people started moving again, returning to their journeys. But something had shifted. The older woman caught his eye as she walked past and nodded, just a small acknowledgement of connection between two strangers. The college students waved. The delivery guy gave him a thumbs up before hoisting his packages and heading off. Robert looked down at his hands again. They were still cramping, still old, still imperfect, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to recapture exactly what he'd lost. Maybe it was just to try, to show up, to let the music out even if it came out messy. He flexed his fingers, working out the cramp. The station was still busy, still full of rushing people and urgent purposes. But for a moment, for just a brief moment, something beautiful had broken through all that chaos. And he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Robert sat at the piano bench, working the cramp out of his left hand when a small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you okay, mister?" He looked down to find a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, staring up at him with big brown eyes full of genuine concern. She wore a pink backpack that was almost as big as she was, and her hair was pulled into 2 crooked pigtails that suggested she'd done them herself. "I'm fine." "Sweetheart," Robert said, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. "Just a little hand cramp. Old age stuff. My grandpa gets those," she said seriously. "Mommy says he should stretch more." Robert couldn't help but smile. "Your mommy sounds smart. Lucy." A harried-looking woman rushed over, pulling the little girl back. "I'm so sorry." She just ran off. "We're going to miss our train." She gave Robert the kind of quick, apologetic smile you give strangers when your kid does something embarrassing, then hurried away, Lucy waving goodbye over her shoulder. That brief exchange did something to Robert. It reminded him of being human in a way that conference rooms and corporate dinners never did. He stretched his hands, working each finger individually the way Mrs. Patterson had taught him decades ago. The cramp was fading, and somewhere in his chest he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was just the stubborn refusal to quit that had built his company in the first place. Either way, he wasn't leaving this bench yet. He placed his hands back on the keys, this time starting with scales, simple warm-ups, the kind he'd done thousands of times as a kid. C major up and down, then G major. His fingers moved slowly at first, then with increasing speed as they remembered the patterns. It was boring stuff, technical exercises that no one wanted to listen to, but it was exactly what he needed. A businessman stopped nearby, checking his phone while obviously waiting for someone. He glanced at Robert, then did a double take. Robert's playing had changed. The hesitant, rusty quality was burning off like morning fog. His fingers were loosening up, finding their confidence. Robert moved from scales into arpeggios, then into something more interesting. A piece by Beethoven, not one of the famous ones that everyone knew. This was a smaller piece, one of the bagatelles. light and playful with a bouncing rhythm that made you want to tap your foot. His teacher had assigned it to him right after his mother died, probably thinking he needed something cheerful to lift his spirits. It hadn't worked back then. He'd played it mechanically, hitting all the right notes while feeling nothing. But now, 45 years later, sitting on a piano bench in the middle of Grand Central Station, something unexpected happened. The music made him smile. It was such a simple thing, that smile. But it felt revolutionary. When was the last time he'd smiled because of pure, uncomplicated joy? Not the professional smile he gave at photo opportunities or the satisfied smile when a deal closed. Just a genuine, spontaneous smile because something delighted him. The businessman who'd been waiting nearby found himself grinning too, though he wasn't sure why. There was just something infectious about the happy little melody bouncing through the station. A woman walking past actually paused mid-stride, her serious expression softening. Robert finished the Beethoven and immediately launched into something else. He was warmed up now and the music was flowing easier. He chose a jazz piece this time, something he'd learned much later in college when he'd briefly joined a band before dropping out to start his company. It was a playful interpretation of Autumn Leaves, full of unexpected chord changes and syncopated rhythms that gave the old standard a fresh feeling. Now heads were definitely turning. Jazz piano was different from classical. It had a pulse, a groove that grabbed you by the chest and made you move. A guy in paint-splattered work clothes stopped to listen, his head bobbing to the rhythm. Two women with shopping bags paused their conversation. The businessman who'd been waiting for someone completely forgot what he was doing and just stood there, watching this scruffy-looking old guy play like he'd been doing it professionally all his life. Because in a way he had, just not for the past 45 years. Robert's confidence was building with every measure. His fingers danced across the keys, improvising around the melody, adding flourishes and runs that surprised even him. Apparently, his hands remembered more than just the pieces he'd practiced as a kid. They remembered the feeling of playing, the joy of musical conversation, the thrill of not knowing exactly where you were going, but trusting that you'd get there. A small crowd was forming now. Maybe 15 or 20 people, scattered in a loose semicircle around the piano. Some were genuinely interested in the music. Others were just curious about what had drawn a crowd. That's how these things always start. One person stops, then another, and suddenly there's a moment happening where there wasn't one before. A teenager pulled out his phone and started recording. Robert didn't notice. He was too focused on the music, on the feel of the keys under his fingers. On the way, the station's acoustics turned his playing into something bigger and more resonant than it would have been in a regular room. He transitioned from jazz into something more contemplative. Debussy, delicate and impressionistic like musical watercolors. Clair de Lune, the piece that showed up in every movie and TV show but that somehow never got old if you played it right. His mother had loved this one. She'd saved up to take him to a concert once where a famous pianist had performed it, and she'd cried during the performance, though she'd tried to hide it. Robert played it for her now all these years later. He played it the way he wished he could have played it at her funeral, but he'd been too angry and hurt to even try. He played all the grief he'd never properly processed, all the love he'd never adequately expressed, all the gratitude for the sacrifices she'd made to give him music in the first place. The crowd grew quieter. Some people had their eyes closed. Others stared at the piano or at Robert or at nothing in particular. The music had that effect. It created a bubble of stillness in the middle of all the chaos, a moment where everyone could just stop and feel something together. A woman in a business suit had tears running down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She just let them fall while she listened. Next to her, a man in a delivery uniform had removed his cap and held it against his chest like he was at a memorial service. Maybe he was. Maybe everyone brings their own losses and longings to moments like this, and the music just gives them permission to feel what they've been pushing down. Robert's playing grew softer, more intimate. This was the quietest section of Clair de Lune, the part that barely whispered. You had to really listen to hear it. The crowd instinctively leaned forward, going completely silent so they wouldn't miss a note. Even the station seemed to quiet down, though of course it didn't. It was just that everyone in this little bubble had tuned out everything else. Then Robert did something unexpected. He took the final delicate notes of the Debussy and used them as a bridge into something completely different. Ragtime, Scott Joplin. The entertainer, bright and bouncy and so full of life it was impossible not to smile. The contrast was shocking and perfect, like the sun breaking through clouds. The crowd's energy shifted instantly. People started grinning. A few laughed out loud from pure surprise and delight. The teenager recording on his phone actually whooped. Robert's fingers flew across the keys, playing the intricate syncopated rhythm that made ragtime so infectious. His left hand provided a steady marching beat while his right hand danced playfully above it. This was showing off, and Robert knew it. But he was having too much fun to care. How long had it been since he'd shown off just for the joy of it? In business, you showed off strategically, to intimidate competitors or impress investors. But this was different. This was the pure pleasure of saying, "Watch this," and then delivering something that made people happy. A little kid in the crowd started dancing, just bouncing up and down unselfconsciously the way kids do. His mother laughed and started swaying along. Then an older gentleman did a little shuffle step, and his wife playfully swatted his arm, but she was grinning too. The music was infectious. It gave everyone permission to be a little silly, a little joyful, to forget for a moment about deadlines and responsibilities and all the serious adult things that usually weighed them down. Robert was grinning now too, really grinning, the kind that made his face hurt. His fingers were flying. His whole body was moving with the rhythm, and he felt more alive than he had in years. This was it. This was the thing he'd been missing without even knowing it. Not the music itself, though that was part of it. It was the connection, the sharing, the simple human act of creating something beautiful and offering it freely to anyone who wanted to receive it. The crowd was growing. 30 people now, maybe 40. Word was spreading through the station in that mysterious way word spreads. Something's happening near the piano. Someone's really playing. You should check it out. More phones came out. Videos were being recorded from multiple angles. Somewhere out there in the digital universe, these clips would soon be uploaded, shared, commented on. But Robert didn't know that yet, and even if he had, he wouldn't have cared. He was too busy playing, too caught up in the moment to worry about anything beyond the next measure, the next phrase, the next opportunity to surprise and delight this unexpected audience. He brought The Entertainer to its triumphant conclusion with a flourish, throwing in a few extra embellishments just because he could. The crowd burst into applause, louder this time, more enthusiastic. Someone whistled. People were calling out encouragement. "More," someone shouted. "Don't stop," yelled someone else. Robert's heart was pounding, but not from exhaustion. From exhilaration. He felt like a kid again, like he could play forever and never get tired. His hands were warm and loose, ready for anything. The station's energy had changed. People weren't just rushing through anymore. They were stopping, watching, participating in this unexpected moment of shared beauty. He looked out at the crowd, really looked at them for the first time. All these different people from all these different lives brought together by music, young and old, rich and poor. Every race and background you could imagine. That was New York right there. That was humanity. All of them had somewhere to be, something important waiting for them. But they'd chosen to stay here instead, even just for a few minutes, because something about this moment mattered more. And Robert realized something that hit him like a physical force. This mattered more than anything he'd done in the past 30 years. More than his company, more than his billions, more than any deal he'd ever closed or any innovation he'd ever created. This simple act of sitting at a public piano and playing for strangers was the most important thing he'd done in decades. Because this was real. This was true. This was human connection in its purest form, with no agenda, no strategy, no ulterior motive. Just beauty offered freely, received gratefully. He placed his hands on the keys again. The crowd went quiet, waiting. Robert closed his eyes and began to play something he'd never played in public before. Something he'd only played alone in the rare quiet moments of his life. His own composition. Something he'd written in college and never shown anyone. It was time to share it. The piece Robert began to play existed nowhere in the world except in his memory. No sheet music, no recording, no title. He'd written it in his tiny dorm room at MIT. 22 years old, running on coffee and ambition. Taking a break from coding to work out something he'd been hearing in his head for weeks. Back then, he'd been at a crossroads. His startup was gaining traction. Investors were interested, but he'd also been offered a scholarship to study music composition. The scholarship letter sat on his desk for 3 weeks while he tried to figure out who he was supposed to be. In the end, he'd chosen the practical path, the safe path, the path that would lead to security and success and making something of himself. He'd never regretted that choice. Not exactly. But he'd never forgotten this piece either, this little window into the life he didn't choose. It started quietly, almost tentatively, a simple melody in the right hand, searching for something. The left hand provided a gentle, uncertain harmony underneath. The music asked questions without answering them. It captured that feeling of standing at a fork in the road, knowing that whichever way you choose, you lose the other path forever. The crowd stayed perfectly still. This was different from everything he'd played before. You could hear in the notes that this piece meant something personal, something private that the composer was choosing to share. It made you feel like you were being trusted with something precious and fragile. Robert's playing grew more confident as the piece developed. The melody found its footing. The harmonies became richer and more complex. This section was about the excitement of choosing, of committing to a path and running forward with everything you had. The music swelled with energy and purpose, fingers flying across the keys in cascading runs that suggested acceleration, forward motion, the rush of building something from nothing. A man in the crowd wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one noticed. But the woman next to him had tears streaming down her face too. They didn't know each other, probably never would. But in that moment they were experiencing the same emotion, connected by nothing but the honesty of this music. The piece shifted again, moving into its middle section. The tempo slowed. The melody became more introspective, almost melancholy. This was about the quiet moments late at night when you wondered about the roads not taken, the relationships you didn't pursue, the dreams you set aside, the sacrifices you made and whether they were worth it. Robert's eyes were closed now, and his face was unguarded in a way it never was in boardrooms or at galas. You could see everything he was feeling, all the regret and nostalgia and complicated emotions that came with a life fully lived, but not quite complete. His hands moved over the keys with a tenderness that made it clear he was pouring his heart out, note by note. The crowd had grown to over 100 people now. The entire center of the Grand Central Concourse had become an impromptu concert hall. New arrivals kept stopping, drawn by the music and the unusual sight of such a large, silent crowd in the middle of one of the busiest transit hubs in the world. Among the newcomers was a professional music critic who'd been on her way to review a concert uptown. She'd planned to walk straight through the station to catch her train, but something in the music made her stop. She listened for 30 seconds, then pulled out her notebook. This was the kind of authentic, emotionally raw performance that you couldn't find in concert halls anymore. This mattered. Also in the crowd was the teenage girl who'd been recording on her phone. She'd already posted a short clip to social media with the caption, "Random guy at Grand Central is amazing." In the 20 minutes since she'd posted it, the video had gotten 3,000 views. People were commenting, sharing, asking who the pianist was. The numbers were climbing exponentially, though she didn't know it yet because she was too absorbed in the performance to check her phone. Robert's composition built toward its climax, the music growing in intensity and emotion. This section was about acceptance, about making peace with the choices you'd made, about finding beauty in the life you actually lived instead of mourning the life you imagined. The melody soared, supported by powerful chords in the left hand that suggested strength and resolution. His fingers hammered the keys with passionate force, not quite loud but emotionally explosive. This was everything he'd kept bottled up for decades. All the feelings he'd never expressed, all the music he'd never shared. It poured out of him in waves of sound that filled the enormous station and seemed to shake the very air. People in the crowd were openly crying now. Not just a few, but dozens. Some were crying for their own lost dreams, others for relationships that ended, some for parents who'd sacrificed everything, some just from the overwhelming beauty of the moment, from the gift of experiencing something so raw and real and true. An older gentleman in the crowd suddenly grabbed his wife's hand and squeezed it tight. They'd been married for 41 years, had fallen into comfortable routine, rarely talked about anything deeper than what to have for dinner. But this music was reminding him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place, all those years ago when they were young and everything was possible. She squeezed back, understanding without words. The music began to soften, moving into its final section. The melody became simpler, more peaceful. The harmonies resolved in a way that felt like coming home after a long journey. This wasn't a happy ending exactly, but it was a true one. It said that life was complicated and bittersweet and beautiful and painful all at once, and that was okay. That was what it meant to be human. Robert played the last few measures with infinite gentleness, like he was putting a child to bed. The final chord hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. The natural reverb of the station caught it and held it, letting it dissolve slowly rather than ending abruptly. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence after that much emotion was almost sacred, and everyone instinctively understood that you don't break that kind of silence too quickly. You let it sit. You honor what just happened. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first, deliberately, like each clap mattered. Others joined in, then more. Then everyone, erupting into thunderous applause that echoed through the station like a physical force. People weren't just clapping politely. They were clapping with their whole bodies. Some raising their hands over their heads, others whistling and cheering. Robert opened his eyes, startled. He'd been so lost in the music that he'd almost forgotten where he was. The sight of over 100 people applauding made him blink in confusion. For him, that piece had been intensely personal, a conversation with his younger self, but apparently it had meant something to all these strangers too. That was incredible, someone shouted. Play more, called another voice. Who are you? Asked a third. Robert stood up from the bench, slightly shaky. His legs had gone numb from sitting so long. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. He raised a hand in an awkward wave, not sure what else to do. He wasn't performing artist. He didn't know how to take a bow or handle an ovation. That's when people started approaching, not aggressively, but with genuine warmth and gratitude. An elderly woman reached him first, tears still on her cheeks. She took both his hands in hers. Thank you, she said simply. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. Before Robert could respond, a young man in a business suit stepped forward. I was about to quit my job today. Give up on what I really wanted to do because it seemed too risky. But your music, he trailed off, struggling to find words. It reminded me why I can't give up. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes spoke next. My daughter is studying music, and I've been trying to talk her out of it, telling her to be practical. But listening to you play, I realized I've been wrong. Some things matter more than being practical. More people crowded around, each wanting to share how the music had affected them. Stories poured out. A man who'd been estranged from his father for 10 years pulled out his phone to make a call. A woman who'd been heading to sign divorce papers decided to go home and try one more time to save her marriage. A student who'd been thinking about dropping out of medical school because of the pressure felt renewed determination to keep going. Robert listened to each person, overwhelmed. He'd given motivational speeches to thousands of people over the years, carefully crafted messages designed to inspire and influence, but they'd never had an impact like this. They'd never been this real. The crowd gradually began to disperse, people remembering they had trains to catch, appointments to keep. But they left transformed in small ways, carrying something of the music with them. The teenage girl who'd been recording came up shyly. I posted a video of you playing, she admitted. I hope that's okay. It's kind of going viral. Viral, the word made Robert's stomach flip. He'd been so focused on the music, on the moment, that he hadn't thought about the consequences of playing in such a public place. Of course people were recording. Of course it would end up online. That's how the world worked now. How viral? He asked, trying to sound casual. She showed him her phone. The view count had jumped to 40,000. Comments were flooding in. People were trying to identify him, figure out who he was. Some were speculating he was a music professor. Others thought he might be a retired concert pianist. A few people had posted that he looked familiar, like someone famous, but they couldn't quite place him. It was only a matter of time before someone figured it out. Robert felt panic rising in his chest. This was supposed to be his private moment, his chance to be anonymous and free, but that freedom was about to end. Once people knew he was Robert Chen, billionaire, everything would change. The narrative would shift from mysterious talented pianist to rich guy showing off. The authenticity of the moment would be questioned. He needed to leave. Now, before anyone recognized him. But as he looked around the station, at the faces of the people who were still lingering, still processing what they'd experienced, he realized something. It was too late to protect his privacy. That ship had sailed the moment he sat down at this piano, and maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. A security guard approached. The same one who'd been watching Robert suspiciously at the beginning. His demeanor was completely different now. "Sir," he said respectfully, "that was something special. I've worked here 15 years, seen a lot of people play that piano. Nobody ever played like that." "Thank you," Robert said quietly. "There's going to be more crowd soon," the guard continued. "Word is spreading fast. You might want to—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Robert nodded. He understood. It was time for one more piece, one final goodbye to this moment before everything changed. He turned back to the piano, and the remaining crowd, sensing something significant was about to happen, went quiet again. He sat down at the bench one last time. His hands were tired now, his emotions wrung out, but he had one more piece in him. The biggest, most difficult, most emotionally demanding piece he knew. The piece that would say everything he couldn't put into words. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play Rachmaninoff. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 crashed through Grand Central Station like a wave breaking against rocks. Robert had chosen the most ambitious piece possible, one that was normally performed with a full orchestra, but that he would attempt alone, adapting and improvising the orchestral parts as best he could. It was audacious, maybe even reckless. This piece was famous for being brutally difficult, emotionally devastating, and physically exhausting. Concert pianists spent months preparing to perform it. Robert hadn't played it in over 40 years, and even back then he'd barely managed it. But something had shifted inside him during this strange morning at the piano. He'd stopped worrying about being perfect. He'd stopped caring about judgment or failure or making mistakes. He was playing for the same reason people climb mountains or write poetry or fall in love. Because some things are worth doing even if you might fail, especially if you might fail. His fingers flew across the keys with fierce intensity. The music was massive, overwhelming, full of passion and longing and desperate beauty. Rachmaninoff had written this concerto while struggling with severe depression, pouring all his pain and hope and determination to survive into the notes. It was music about fighting your way back from darkness, about refusing to give up even when everything seemed lost. The crowd that had been dispersing suddenly stopped. New people flooded into the concourse, drawn by the power of the music. Within minutes, the audience had swelled to over 200 people. They packed in around the piano, standing on benches and stairs to get a better view, phones held high to capture this impossible moment. Robert's face was intense, focused, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the station's air conditioning. His whole body moved with the music, swaying and leaning into the powerful phrases, pulling back for the tender moments. This wasn't just piano playing. This was a physical act, almost athletic in its demands. The piece built in waves, each section more demanding than the last. Robert's arrangement for solo piano required his left hand to cover the orchestral bass lines, while his right hand played the melody and harmonies. It was like juggling while running a marathon. His hands were cramping again, his shoulders aching, his back protesting from the awkward angle, but he pushed through, driven by something bigger than physical comfort. A woman in the crowd grabbed her friend's arm. "Oh my God," she whispered, staring at her phone screen. "I know who that is." "What? Who?" "That's Robert Chen, the tech billionaire. He's worth like $4 billion. The information rippled through the crowd like electricity. People pulled up Wikipedia pages, Google image searches, Forbes articles. The scruffy-looking old man at the piano transformed in their perception. Suddenly, his worn jacket and faded jeans became an eccentric billionaire's disguise. His presence at a public piano became a bizarre story rather than a simple moment. But Robert was oblivious to all of this. He'd reached the second movement of the concerto, the famous adagio that had been featured in countless movies because of its achingly beautiful melody. This was the emotional heart of the piece, where all the pain and loneliness and desperate hope came pouring out in long, singing phrases that could break your heart. Robert played it like a man saying goodbye. Goodbye to the identity he'd built over 30 years. Goodbye to the carefully controlled public image. Goodbye to the distance he'd maintained between his true self and the world. Each note was a confession, an apology, a declaration of surrender. Tears were streaming down his face now. He didn't wipe them away. He just kept playing, his fingers finding the notes even though he could barely see through the blur. The music spoke of everything he'd sacrificed to build his empire. The friendships he'd neglected. The relationships he'd avoided. The simple joys he'd dismissed as frivolous. All of it acknowledged and mourned and finally released. The crowd had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop if it weren't for the piano. Even the usual station announcements seemed to have paused out of respect. Over 200 people stood transfixed, barely breathing, witnesses to something they didn't fully understand but knew was important. Among them was a journalist from the New York Times who'd been on her way to interview a politician. She'd already scrapped that story in her mind. This was the story. Billionaire tech CEO playing Rachmaninoff in Grand Central while dressed like a homeless person. It had everything: wealth, mystery, authentic emotion, and that ineffable quality that made people care. Also in the crowd was a professional classical pianist who'd performed this exact concerto at Carnegie Hall just last month. She watched Robert's hands with professional appreciation. His technique wasn't perfect. He fumbled notes here and there, simplified some of the most difficult passages, occasionally lost the tempo. But the emotional interpretation was flawless. This was how Rachmaninoff was meant to be played, like your life depended on it, like the music was being torn from your chest. The adagio built to its climax, a moment of such tender beauty that it felt almost unbearable. Robert's hands trembled as he played it, exhausted but unwilling to stop. The melody soared one last time before settling gently, like something precious being carefully set down. Then the finale exploded into being. The third movement was fast, triumphant, technically brutal. It was music about joy after suffering, about choosing life even after you've seen the darkness. Robert attacked it with everything he had left, his tired hands flying across the keys in patterns so fast they blurred together. The crowd gasped audibly at several passages that seemed impossible for one person to play. How was he doing this? Some of them watched videos on their phones of famous performances of this concerto, comparing. This random performance in a train station was holding its own against professional recordings. Robert's vision was starting to swim. His hands were screaming in protest. His back felt like it might give out. But he was almost there, almost at the end of this impossible journey he'd started this morning when he walked out of his penthouse in disguise. Just a little further. The music raced toward its conclusion, building and building until it seemed like the entire station was vibrating with sound. Robert played the final triumphant chords with all his remaining strength, his hands crashing down on the keys in a declaration of victory and survival and defiant, joyful existence. The last notes rang out, held by the pedal, sustained and then slowly fading into silence. Robert collapsed forward, his forehead nearly touching the keys, gasping for breath. His hands throbbed. His entire body shook from exhaustion and spent emotion. He'd given everything he had, poured out his entire soul through those keys. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was complete, then the applause began. Not the polite clapping from before. This was something else entirely. It started as a roar and kept building, growing impossibly louder as all 200 people erupted simultaneously. They clapped and cheered and whistled and shouted. Some people jumped up and down. Others embraced strangers next to them. The sound was so loud it echoed through the entire station, drawing even more people to see what was happening. Robert slowly sat up, dazed and overwhelmed. The crowd pressed closer, their faces shining with emotion. Money started appearing. People threw bills toward the piano. 5s, 10s, 20s, even a few hundreds. They pushed forward to place money on the bench beside him. In the basket someone had grabbed from a nearby shop.